Hi, welcome. Today in this video we're going to paint a watercolor study of a sphere using a simple palette of a blue and a brown to just focus on the values and turning that flat shape into the illusion of form. So if that sounds interesting, just stick around. But before we get started, I wanted to ask that you hit the subscribe button if you're enjoying these videos and maybe share the video with a friend. Thanks. Today I'm painting a sphere from direct observation in watercolor, so stick around. I'll start with a light pencil sketch of my subject. To draw a sphere, I want to draw from my shoulder and not from my wrist. What I like to do is give myself some practice rounds before I ever touch the pencil to the paper. Getting my arm warmed up, and once I feel confident, I'm going to lay the pencil down and just keep it really light. The sphere can have a really simple background. You could draw in a horizon line to separate the ground from the space behind it. I've got a little bit of a drapery set up with mine, so I'm going to just go ahead and sketch in lightly some lines that indicate where that drapery is. Okay, so I've got my sphere. It doesn't have to be perfect. Remember, this is just a study. What I'm going to do is look for my lightest lights and my darkest darks. My light is about right here, my lightest light. And then my darkest dark, which is going to be my core shadow, is right about here. So as I study that sphere, I'm going to think about the direction of the light. Again, the lights come in on my setup from this way. What I want to do is basically do a light to dark. Now, with watercolor, I need to reserve the white of the paper for my highlight. So my highlight, I'm not even going to add color or add any paint to this area. I'm going to block it off. You could mask it off with masking fluid. Really, I just want to give myself some lines so I remember to not paint over this section. On my sphere, I have a highlight, light, halftone, core shadow, shadow, and reflected light in my cast shadow. Because my object is unidirectionally lit from the window off to the right side, you'll notice that it's lighter towards the right and darker towards the left side. So I've got my lines just mapping out the boundary of the object, the general area where my highlight is, the general area where my core shadow is, and I'll sketch in the general direction of my cast shadow. I'm going to go ahead and start by pre-wetting the object, and I want to make sure my brush is really clean. And I'm going to go ahead and wet the object, even the area that's the highlight. What I'm going to do next is load my brush. I've got a really diluted neutral here, and I can test it out on my test sheet to see. I just want it to be really light, so if I want to add just a bit more water to it. Okay, so I'm going to use this. I'm going to blot a little bit just to take away some of that water, and I'm going to go around just being careful not to go right into where the highlight is. Now I did that first coat did have some color in it, so it's not purely the white of the paper, but it's still really light. Okay, so I'm just going to blot some of that excess, just lift some of that color. So now I'm going to go in and add a little more paint to my brush. It's a little darker now, and I'm going to start going in and darkening out towards the edges. Whoops. And you know, if you go past the boundary of the shape, it's okay, or of the form, it's all right, don't worry. All right, I'm using a big brush for this. Use a big brush, don't use a tiny brush. I mean, you can use a tiny brush, but I think a big brush works better. And I can kind of modify the form as I go. All right, so I'm going to go back in and add some more paint to my brush. I'm going to gradually go a little darker. Okay, so that tone's a little darker. I'm not really worrying about color today. I'm just thinking about value and where do I see light gradually getting darker, and then it gets a little lighter again. So remember, there's the highlight, the light, the halftone, the core shadow, which is the darkest area, which I'm seeing is about about here. I'm not going to go as dark as I want to go quite yet. And then it gets a little lighter towards this edge, this bottom edge, which is where I'm seeing the reflected light and light that's reflecting from the surface beneath it. Okay, so now you can start to see those values taking shape, and hopefully the shape taking form, or becoming a form as I work my light to dark values. I'm going to go ahead and go in. Let me test it first. Just going to go a little darker. And the paper is still wet. If the paper were drying, I'd get more hard edges between my values. But since this paper is very absorbent, it's drying very slowly, I've got some time to work wet into wet. All right, so I'm going in, I'm darkening around. This reflected light will not be nearly as light as that highlight is, so I don't have to worry. I know that I'm still gonna go a little darker. I'm gonna add a little more brown to my blue, bring in a little more blue and make that more concentrated as I get into my coarse shadow. That might be a little much, but we'll see. Okay, so my darkest area of the sphere is really kind of right here. And it doesn't have to match exactly. I just want to get an approximation. That's all I'm going for. So here we go. I'm going to lay it in. I'm not going to mess with it too much. I'm going to go ahead and start blocking in some of the cast shadow too. So the cast shadow is really dark. It's going to be my darkest dark, and there's some value changes within that, but I don't have to get all of that information in. Again, I can simplify it. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of block in the shape I'm seeing. It's not so clear because it's laying on a fabric, so there's kind of curvature to that shape. But if it were just on the flat table, I'd see those boundaries, those edges of that shadow a little more precisely. I'm going to go in now with a smaller brush and go ahead and mix up more paint that is less diluted. Okay, that's nice and dark. And again, I could, this is something to experiment with, whether the paper is super wet or partially wet or even dry, because that's going to affect your edges, how dry or damp or wet the paper is. And again, remember, I'm going for approximation, so this doesn't have to match exactly. It just is going to resemble what I'm seeing. It's going to be an abstraction. As I'm doing this study, I'm getting a sense of the rate at which my paper is drying, and if I want to keep really soft edges, I just need to make sure my paper is still damp. If I want harder edges, crisper edges, I want to wait for the paper to dry. So I've got a foundation of values established on my sphere, but it's just floating in this empty space. And actually, it's starting to look like a form. That flat shape is now appearing somewhat roundish. Okay, so I'm going to lay in a horizon line. It's not exactly what I'm seeing, but just what I want to do is situate this sphere in some kind of space. And establishing some values around the sphere is going to help me do that. I can, observe what I'm looking at. There's actually quite a lot going on in this. I've got a drapery of fabric behind it. And what I have to keep in mind, though, is still the direction of the light kind of all around. And because I'm next to a window, a lot of light's coming from the right side. And I want to use my values in the background to just help pop this sphere out. So overall, behind it is darker. Even the lightest lights in this area is a good bit darker. It's also a little, well, what I can do is make it a little cooler, because the general rule is warm colors come forward and cool colors recede. So I'm going to push my gray a little more towards blue, a little less brown, and go ahead and go a good bit darker. I'm just going to go in, here we go, and work around my object. The object itself is pretty dry now, so I don't have to worry about these two kind of merging together. And I'm going to go ahead and just spread this tone around. It doesn't have to be perfect. Again, I'm just establishing some general tone, which is just, it's gonna do a little bit more to help, again, situate that sphere in a space. And you know, this paper has got some wonderful tooth or texture to it. It's a cold press paper. And you know, I don't need to just cover up every inch of it. I can leave some of these edges a little loose, you know, like a loose sketch. But now that changed my core shadow, so what I want to do is go back in and reinforce it and darken it a little more. And I noticed I said core shadow when I meant to say cast shadow. And I could, you know, I'm going to attempt it with a big brush. I might want to switch to a small brush, but we'll see how this works. Okay. And again, you know, you can see where the edges are staying crisp. That paper's dry. This shape met up with the area that I just covered with a wash, so that one's wet. So that paint is diffusing out into the damper area, which I kind of like. You know, it doesn't have to be, I think if the edge is really just solid and even all the way around, it's just going to have a more graphic sort of appearance. If the edges are a little softer, it just can help give it a little more of a natural feel. And if I want to soften some of the edges, like maybe go back in and soften the edge kind of towards the back of the shadow, I can do that. Keep the front area kind of crisper. But again, what I want to avoid is going back in and just like messing with it too much. And you can see I just dripped some water just from, you know, rinsing my brush. So be careful, you know, if you're reaching over your painting to any additional water is going to create these blooms, or they call them runbacks or back runs. So again, I think I'm going to stop there for this first study, and we'll take a look. I could call this study done, but I'm going to go in and just see if I can do a little bit more to the background to just vary those tones a bit, help it just have a more natural feel. I noticed that there's some darker values in this area. This paper's pretty dry, so as you notice, a mark is going to leave a harder edge. I'm going to keep it kind of loose. This color is pretty close to the blue of the cloth I have behind it. But remember, any water I add back into the mix is going to reactivate the paint. You know, I can layer it and sort of glaze on top, and as long as I just kind of get in and get out, and I don't, you know, as long as I don't kind of move my brush back and forth, I can continue to sort of build up some layers. But this is the part where I think it's easy to overwork what's working, and that's okay. You know, if you do overwork the painting, don't worry. I've done many of these studies, and you know, some of them go beautifully, and then some of them, you know, just kind of turn to mud a little bit if I, you know, want to go back in and keep adjusting things. So it takes practice. I would recommend doing multiple paintings, and you know, you'll get the hang of it. And if you know, it's been a little while since you've worked with this, like for me, it's been a while since I've done this. So you know, right now I'm kind of getting the feel for watercolor again. I'm not using it on a super regular basis right now. So I know, I just, with that understanding, I can, you know, it can help me not stress about my painting and what's happening. And also I'm working, you know, beside this really big, nice bay window, and the light is constantly changing. So I'm noticing as the, you know, it's getting a little darker on this side of the composition. So, you know, as I adjust one thing, I'm going to have to adjust something else. Okay, so I can quickly lose my cast shadow, and let's see what I can do. We'll just treat this as an experiment right now. If it works, it works. If not, we learned a lot from this, or at least I learned a lot from this. So, yep, test it. Okay, that's a good bit darker. I'll go in and just reinforce that core shadow. Again, try not to be too fussy with it. I may say, oh, I should have stopped, and that's okay. You know, that's all right. Again, this is all a learning process. So there we go.